Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the UBC Learning Circle. We are thrilled to be here today in conversation for placing Indigenous people at the decision-making table. 1 year of implementing the Indigenous Strategic Plan at UBC. Joining us in circle for this important conversation is Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, Adrian Vidan, Vicky George, Dr. Daniel Justice, Dr. Carrie Charnley, and Noah Chenoweth. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm beyond excited to jump into it. Before I get into anything else, my name is Drew St. Laurent. I'm Cree Métis from Treaty 1 Territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the Senior Operations Manager at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health at UBC. I would like to acknowledge that I'm zooming into you today from the ancestral unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and our partners, the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, and the UBC Okanagan campus for this first time UBC cross-campus Indigenous engagement for meaningful reconciliation and decolonization. A gentle reminder here that the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself. If at any point you feel you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, please don't hesitate to do so. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our facilitator for today's session, Vicky George. Welcome.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much for that lovely welcoming. I am going to introduce myself and then do a quick roundtable of our panelists this afternoon. I am Vicky George. I'm the Associate Director at the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives on the Vancouver campus. And our panelists today are Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, Adrian Vidan, Daniel Justice, Carrie Charnley, and Noah Chenoweth. And I will turn it over to Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot to do a quick intro.
Thanks so much, Vicky. I'm very happy to be with everyone today and very pleased to join this circle of my esteemed colleagues. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cheryl Lightfoot, and I am Anishinaabe from the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe. Here at UBC, I wear a number of hats. I'm on faculty in political science, Indigenous studies, and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. I'm a Canada Research Chair of Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, and also serve as Senior Advisor to the UBC President on Indigenous Affairs, where I've had the privilege of being part of this Indigenous Strategic Planning team for the last several years, and also now am part of the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives to help guide and support the implementation of the plan.
Thanks, Cheryl. Over to you, Adrian.
Hello and good day, everyone. So excited to be gathered here with you all this afternoon. Joining you today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx people. I'm a member of the Okanagan Indian Band and Director of Indigenous Programs and Services and Senior Advisor to the Deputy Vice Chancellor on Indigenous Affairs at the Okanagan campus.
Thank you, Adrian. Over to you, Noah.
Hi, my name is Noah. I am a fifth-year Indigenous Studies student here at UBC Okanagan. I am part of the Upper Nicola Indian Band, part of the Okanagan Nation, and I am very honored to be here today. But aside from this, I also work at Indigenous Programs and Services as a peer mentor.
Thanks, Noah. Over to you, Daniel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Justice. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation through my father and through my mother of mixed settler heritage, and a professor at UBC Vancouver. And I'm Skyping in from Hulhuay on Shishalswea, the traditional territories of the Sishal people in what is commonly called the Sunshine Coast. Really pleased to be here.
Thank you. And over to Carrie.
Wai Hasselhalt, Ishuael. My name is Carrie Charnley. I'm a member of the Katzie First Nation of the Coast Salish. I'm coming to you from Musqueam territory, unceded territory. and happy to be here. I'm an assistant professor of teaching at UBC Okanagan. Looking forward to moving there soon. And I'm in the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies, and my focus is land-based Indigenous pedagogies in the university and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Thank you so much to the panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl and Adrian. They will be presenting for you folks to start today.
Thanks, Vicky. And very happy to share a bit of a slide deck with you to launch our conversation this afternoon. As you can see, we launched this Indigenous Strategic Plan just over a year ago in September 2020. And so we want to share a bit today about how important it is that we have placed Indigenous people at decision-making tables, and both celebrate the first year of our implementation progress of the Indigenous Strategic Plan at UBC, and then talk about some of its impacts and challenges in our ongoing work. Go ahead and take us to the next slide, please. So we really have to begin our conversation about the Indigenous Strategic Plan by talking first about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because we have placed that as the centerpiece, the philosophical base, and the impetus behind the Indigenous Strategic Plan. And so I want to highlight just a few key points to keep in mind as we discuss the university's ISP, Indigenous Strategic Plan, and how important the UN Declaration is to that conversation. So first of all, it's important that we all understand and really appreciate that what we now know as the UN Declaration all began with elders and youth and activists and knowledge keepers sitting together in circles in council way back in the 1970s. And doing so in a number of countries simultaneously, including Canada. And they were so frustrated at the time by the ongoing presence of perfectly legal discrimination against them and the continued sidelining of inherent Indigenous rights in each of the countries that they were talking about. And they began discussing together with one another what the future should look like and what that would look like if the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples could be respected, could be articulated and communicated through Western legal language, perhaps. And they focused a great deal of energy on what healthy and respectful relationships could look like between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And so at that time, they began to organize on the grassroots level, which in just a few years' time brought them all the way to the United Nations in Geneva. And then fast forwarding 4 decades, a full 40 years later, what eventually became the UN Declaration and passed through the UN General Assembly was very similar to the very first documents that those groups of elders and knowledge keepers and activists put together back in the 1970s. And the UN Declaration, it's important to understand, is a remedial document. It's intended to help correct literally centuries of marginalization, discrimination, and dispossession. As a United Nations declaration, it is not legally binding in the same way that we understand domestic court cases or domestic law or even international treaties, but it does still have diverse legal effects in this country. It is the bare minimum standard of Indigenous peoples' human rights. And importantly, for our purposes at UBC, it was explicitly cited by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada as the framework for what reconciliation should mean in Canada. In day-to-day practice, it's intended to serve as a guide for policy development, for negotiations, and also for litigation. And importantly for us in a university, it's also a good guide for what better and improved relationships should look like. So when we started to think and about how to put it into practice, and as we approached our new Indigenous strategic planning process in the late teens, 17, 18, 19, which was in the shadow of the TRC's final report, we decided collectively that it was very appropriate to foreground the UN declaration in our new Indigenous strategic plan. And because no one else in the world had yet done this in a university setting, we had to start from the bottom up, and we had to engage in a process that designed a plan that would provide the university the guidance for what implementing the declaration could mean in a post-secondary space. Go ahead to the next slide, and I'll turn over to Adrienne.
Thank you, Cheryl. The ISP is a university plan, and a new network model for ISP implementation has been created that is Indigenous-led. This implementation structure is relational and distributed to allow for a collective response. It is the responsibility of everyone to advance the ISP. It's been really exciting to see the development of this implementation model over the last year once the ISP has been launched. The model has an Indigenous-led advisory and implementation committees with Indigenous faculty, students, and staff at decision-making tables from across both campuses through the creation of 2 new committees, the ISP Executive Advisory Committee and the ISP Coordinating Committee. Indigenous people are at decision-making tables, which hasn't happened before through committee structures at UBC. And it's also exciting to know that units and portfolios from across both campuses are engaging with the ISP Toolkit. And from the Okanagan campus, this has included the AVP Students portfolio, the School of Social Work, the Graduate Student Advisory Council, and more. Next slide, please. To share a little bit more about the ISP background, the current 2020 ISP plan really honors and builds on the framework that was created from the 2008 Aboriginal Strategic Plan. Since 2008, the current ISP, as Dr. Lightfoot was mentioning, really centers and honors the work of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. But since 2008, there's also been the TRC Calls to Action in 2015, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Calls for Justice in 2019. So the current ISP really centers the work and calls for action in each of these documents. In October of 2017, work started underway from a committee made up of individuals across both campuses for an updated ISP framework. This work took place over just under a year, from October of 2017 to June 2018. And then as work continued the following year, the Board of Governors adopted the vision and mission statements of the ISP. Concurrent to this work, in 2019 at the Okanagan campus, introduced their Declaration of Truth and Reconciliation commitments. And in 2020, a year ago, the ISP was launched across both campuses. So it is the UBC and system-wide response to the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Calls for Justice, and the Vancouver campus's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. And I'll pass it back over to Cheryl.
Thanks, Adrienne. And we wanted to share this infographic with you, which talks about and displays the process that we undertook in order to design the Indigenous Strategic Plan. And as I mentioned earlier, no other university had tried to ground its plan in the UN Declaration. So we were starting from scratch. And what we did was begin to approach various communities and stakeholder groups across both campuses: Indigenous students, non-Indigenous students, Indigenous faculty and staff, non-Indigenous faculty and staff, leadership, deans, and our host communities, both in the Okanagan and in Point Grey here, Musqueam and the Silks Okanagan Nation. All in all, we had 2,500 unique engagements with different individuals and collected over the course of just over half a year, 15,000 total ideas, opinions, and comments about what implementation of the UN Declaration would mean or could mean in UBC. And the feedback that we received was collated and analyzed and ultimately brought us to the 8 goals and 43 actions that make up the plan. And back to Adrienne for the next slide.
Thank you, Cheryl. This diagram illustrates how UBC has a network of relationships and responsibilities with Indigenous peoples, both locally and globally. The diagram shows the network and how UBC, how critical it is for UBC to recognize and attend to each and every one of the relationships within the network in a purposeful and meaningful way. The nearest relationship and responsibilities that we have are with our host nations of Musqueam and the Silks Okanagan Nation. And as an institution, we have formalized relationships with a memorandum of affiliation with the Musqueam and a memorandum of understanding with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. From there, our network and responsibilities build outward to the Indigenous peoples in the Lower Mainland in Okanagan Valley, and from there to Indigenous people of British Columbia, and then outward from there throughout Canada and the United States, and then through there building out globally to the responsibilities that we have to international Indigenous people. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'll pass it back to Cheryl.
Thanks, Adrienne. And Adrienne mentioned the ISP implementation model earlier, but we want to spend just a little bit more time digesting that at this point. And as she mentioned, this is a new, innovative, network-based model for ISP implementation support. And the model that we have designed has embedded Indigenous-led advisory and implementation committees, and also inserted Indigenous people at decision-making tables for the first time, where they have historically been excluded. And this has been done through the creation of 2 new committees, the Indigenous Strategic Plan Executive Advisory Committee for one, and the second is the Indigenous Strategic Plan Coordinating Committee. And both these new committees have begun their work earlier this year and are doing just an amazing job of advancing the Indigenous Strategic Plan already in its first year. We want to emphasize that in no way are implementation measures siloed off just to Indigenous people. Everyone at UBC has a shared and collective responsibility for advancing the ISP, everyone in their own space and in their own way. Our implementation model is intended to be dialogical and relational, and it is expected that units and portfolios also respect these principles in their implementation efforts. What we're trying to avoid in implementation is box ticking exercises and also directives or prescriptions from the top down. Rather, we are asking every unit, every faculty, every work portfolio to do its own work, to align the ISP in their own way. And we are not expecting that every academic unit or every service unit do every single ISP goal and action. In fact, we designed it so that that's an impossibility. No one can take up all 8 goals and 43 action steps in their own workspace. We all have to work together. And the idea is that each unit should focus on where they can have the most impact. And then that's where they should spend their efforts. And then, of course, in terms of evaluation, each portfolio, faculty, and unit should be evaluated on their own plan's success. That way, the model is not uniformly applied, it's not prescriptive, and it can be measured and success looked for in various unique ways across both campuses. Back to Adrienne.
Thank you, Cheryl. There are a number of points across UBC from both campuses where units can gain advice on ISP implementation. At the Okanagan campus, there's the Indigenous Advisory Committee, which considers the current state of Indigenous activities at the Okanagan campus, identifies priority areas of focus for the future, and helps implement strategies to advance these initiatives. At the Vancouver campus, there's the Indigenous Strategic Plan Implementation Committee, which devises and monitors implementation strategies and advises administration on the allocation of resources. And university-wide, there's the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, OIC, which opened in February of 2021 of this year to coordinate the implementation of the ISP across UBC. And then there's the Indigenous Strategic Plan Executive Advisory Committee, or ISPEAC, which identifies ISP priorities, reviews implementation progress, and provides recommendations on funding priorities, projects, and programs, and is made up of Indigenous and non-Indigenous UBC staff, faculties, and students from across both campuses. Next slide, please. And over to Cheryl.
Thanks, Adrienne. Now on this slide, I'm going to use a number of acronyms, so bear with us. So in this graphic, we are talking about accountabilities, and we want to show and demonstrate how accountability is spread across all the levels of the university through which the ISP is to be implemented. So at the very bottom of the graphic, we can see individual faculties, departments, and units, each of which can implement a plan and make daily decisions about their actions, and they can collect their own data. A level above this, we have the 3 committees, some of which we've referred to already, and the ISPEAC, the Indigenous Strategic Plan Executive Advisory Committee, is the new one that joins 2 committees, one on each campus, that were previously existing. In Vancouver, we had the Indigenous Strategic Plan Implementation Committee, or ISPIC, and in the Okanagan, we have the Indigenous Advisory Committee. So these 3 committees work together, and have the new one, the ISPEAC, has representatives from across both campuses. So we are really doubling down our efforts and working in conjunction with one another. And the new ISPEAC committee advises, reviews, and provides recommendations to levels above on Indigenous Strategic Plan priorities and progress. And so if we go one level above, we will see the new Indigenous Strategic Plan Coordinating Committee. And this committee has representatives from the executive team leadership, including President Santa Ono, our 2 senior advisors present here today, and also various vice presidents. It's a decision-making body centered on Indigenous Strategic Plan, priority goals, actions, and crucially, funding. And the decisions made here are centered on the input that the I Speak committee provides to them. Now, the coordinating committee is ultimately accountable to the university's board of governors through the Indigenous Engagement Committee of the board, who has the role of ensuring that the university pursues its goals as set forward in the Indigenous Strategic Plan, and that adequate resources are directed towards its fulfillment. And the ISPCC also feeds up to and reports to the senates on each campus as needed. And together, the Board of Governors and the two senates have ultimate oversight, resource allocation, and academic and policy direction on the Indigenous Strategic Plan. Next slide, please. Now, just a quick note about the ISP's relationship with other initiatives and programs concerning equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's important to remember that implementation of the ISP seeks to amplify Indigenous voices and to bring about structural and innovative change in order to remedy the colonial experience in Canada, which is unique to Indigenous peoples. And so meaningful reconciliation includes EDI work, equity, diversity, inclusion work, but it moves a step even further beyond that because it requires acknowledgement and consideration of the unique and distinctive history, experiences, and lived realities of Indigenous peoples in this country. And while we're all moving in the same direction towards remedying past wrongs and current exclusions and discriminations, the ISP is specifically also emphasizing a collaborative spirit, collectivity, and thoughtful coordination. Now, the next few slides, go ahead and change the slides, please. Take us through the toolkit for ISP implementation, which the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives has developed to help guide units and faculties in their own contexts on implementing the Indigenous Strategic Plan. And the first step in the toolkit is the self-assessment tool. And the self-assessment tool helps units, faculties, initiatives provide a space where they can have conversations, real conversations, genuine conversations, sometimes deep conversations about Indigenous engagement and reconciliation with a specific focus on what that unit or work group is currently doing well and where there are opportunities for improvement. And the toolkit provides an opportunity for units to discuss, slow down, and really deeply reflect on where they are and what their next steps might be in implementation. Go ahead and take us to the next slide, and I'll turn over to Adrian.
Thank you, Cheryl. The second tool in the toolkit is the ISP Intent to Action tool. This tool picks up from the ISP self-assessment tool and starts to take lessons that units have learned through self-reflection and dialogue and transform them into actions within units. The tool provides a logic framework for breaking down the ISP goals and actions and mapping them onto a unit's mission, vision, values, and strategies. There are 3 workshops as part of the Intent to Action toolkit. The first 2 focus on the core planning team, and the final one opens up to unit-wide engagement. By the end of the 3rd workshop, units will have a plan of action as to how to implement the ISP specific to their own context. It is not expected that the unit will choose all 8 goals and 43 actions in the ISP, but rather the tool will help the unit focus on where they can have the greatest impact. And I'll pass it back over to Cheryl.
Thanks, Adrian. And The third tool in the toolkit is the Sample Performance Measurement Framework. And this PMF, Performance Measurement Framework, provides a suggestive sample of what outputs, outcomes, and possible performance measures could be for each one of the 43 actions in the Indigenous Strategic Plan. And this chart can be used by individual departments, units, faculties to help evaluate their Indigenous Strategic Plan related projects and initiatives. And these various outputs, outcomes, and performance measures are up there for guidance. Again, it's a tool. It provides units with some food for thought and examples of how they can measure their progress, because some of these are very difficult ideas to put into usual quantitative measures. So we tried to provide some on-the-ground guidance. And units are free to pick and choose from this performance measurement framework and decide which indicators they find are most appropriate to their individual context. So back to Adrienne for our overview.
Thank you, Cheryl. In closing, the ISP is a path-breaking plan and the first of its kind in North America. Faculties and units will align to the plan where they see the opportunity for greatest impact. It's really exciting through the new committee structure that have been created, as well as the new OIC office, as well as existing committees of the IAC and ISPIC. There are multiple points across both campuses where advice on ISP implementation can be sought. The toolkit provides an opportunity for units to really engage in deep conversation and reflection on where they're currently at and opportunities for them to start to grow and action some of the goals of the ISP. And it's really critical as individuals and units start to go through this process to really focus on this process and not on the outputs, and to really slow down, because as the attention is paid to the and focus is paid to the process, the outputs will follow. Also, in closing, that we know that thoughtful and meaningful change will take time. Just thinking of the process that I was just sharing about, I think it's really critical as we think about the process. It really needs to reflect relationships between campuses, relationships between units and portfolios, and relationships with our community partners. So it's really important that we take the time that's needed to ensure that thoughtful, meaningful change can happen. And lastly, if there's any questions or if you'd like to engage further with the toolkit, please connect with the OIC office at oic.admin@ubc.ca.
Thank you so much, Cheryl and Adrienne, for that overview of the Indigenous Strategic Plan. It's much appreciated. We are going to step into some questions now for our panelists. And I am forever grateful for the panelists joining us today with their expertise and input and feedback that is critical to the ISP from the beginning to today. So I will move to our first question for our panelists. So the first question is, what about the 2020 UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan is exciting and or speaks to you? And I think I'm going to start off with Noah.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you, Dr. George and Adrienne. Kind of just going off that, starting this, all the amazing things they said, that is like one of the most exciting parts, just to be part of this whole community. It is such an amazing opportunity to have as a student. And especially when I talk about being part of this with like my dad, he's like, oh, back in my day, I never got to have any of those opportunities. So it makes me think, what's going to be available for students, you know, like 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line for Indigenous students, you know, like what opportunities are they going to have? But as a student, again, it's exciting to see that UBC is taking steps to continuously improve opportunities for Indigenous students. So as someone who has participated a lot I went on an Indigenous global exchange to Australia. I'm here part of the strategic plan. I have also worked at IPS for 3 years now. So it's really an amazing feeling to see how well the university is connecting and building opportunities for other Indigenous students. And then also it shows how the ISP is complying with the TRC calls to action. So this is a huge step forward for reconciliation as a whole.
Great, thanks, Noah. Appreciate your comments. Carrie.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Noah. So I think for me, the question about what excites me, I mean, everything excites me about it, but one of the key things is indigenizing the curriculum. I think that's going to be very powerful and important, and also strengthening relationships with Indigenous knowledge keepers, cultural experts, and bringing more of those people into the university is super important. And the systemic change of the institution that I'm seeing happening already is super exciting. And the pace at which, it's already happening in this past first year. I've come on board in the past 6 months, and I'm still learning about all the amazing plans and actions and so on. And today, during this talk, I was super excited by the toolkit. And especially, the self-assessment is so vital and key, and the intent to implementation, the intent to action tool really excites me, because I see that as being super key for people across the university. And in terms of challenges, the challenges I see is in terms more of logistics and communication infrastructurally. But looking at the beautiful model that we had today in the presentation about the way the relationships are mapped out and keeping, being aware of that, I think really helps with the logistics and communication focus. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Appreciate your comments. I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
Thank you. I like Carrie and Noah, there's so much about this that really excites me, but I think one really important aspect is that it's a pillar of the university's long-term vision for its relationships and its accountabilities. And it's a vision that came from community. I mean, you look at the chart in the plan that shows all of the different points of consultation and engagement, and this wasn't something that was drafted from on high and imposed on people. It actually emerged from the ground up, and also is in conversation with international conversations around Indigenous peoples' voices and perspectives and roles in these places. So I think for me, that's the most exciting thing, is that we are a model for other institutions, but it's a model that comes from many, many voices. And that, I think, I think it's a very rare thing to see, that much care and time and attention given, that much listening happening, and then actually to see it materialize. So the challenge is always going to be the implementation of that. But I think it comes from a large community of people who truly believe that the work that we are doing at UBC can be better and can do better, and a desire to see that happen.
Thanks, Daniel. So as the facilitator, moderator of this event today, I am also included as a panelist. So I will interject, which is very odd for me to do, and provide my response to this question. So just to recap the question, what about the 2020 ISP is exciting and or speaks to you? So I have a very unique lens in the sense that I am an alumna at UBC Vancouver. I'm also a staff member, current staff member, an Indigenous woman and from BC. And I have direct experience with the previous Aboriginal Strategic Plan from 2008-2009. So I was an undergrad student and I see my words and my feedback and input from back then. So this tells me that this work has been going on for decades. And fast forward to 2020 when we have the finalized ISP document and I come back as a staff person in my role, I was able to see this pivot and this transition happening at UBC, which has been an extraordinary journey for me to see this long game, to see this history, because I do have deep roots at UBC. So the other thing that speaks to me is the leadership. So not only is the ISP team and everybody that's been involved with the ISP have been top-notch folks to bring together the 8 goals and 43 actions. That in itself has been quite a journey. I will also speak to the ISP process that we used. You can find that ISP process document, which is about 83 pages, I think. I geek out with this kind of information because it really lays the groundwork for this ground up ISP process. This is a strat plan that is not top down. And so it showed us what we did in our engagement sessions and so forth, listening to the student voice, the faculty voice, and the staff voice. And then lastly, I think what really excites me about this too is the level of commitment and interest at the leadership levels across the university at Vancouver and Okanagan that see the importance of our human rights being acknowledged and recognized and honored, in that the ISP is also an Indigenous-led strat plan. And we have leadership that have worked on the ISP toolkit. The President's office has worked on the toolkit. The Provost's office has worked on the toolkit. So we are seeing leadership at all levels across the university engaging appropriately and engaging properly with Indigenous peoples. So that would be the things top of mind for me. And I will pass it over to Adrian.
Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, I agree with all the comments made by the panelists. It's really exciting to think of the ISP and the 8 goals and 43 actions, and really hard not to get excited about all of them, and really thinking about how holistic the plan is in terms of connecting to all aspects of the institution. And I think it's really exciting to think of the Okanagan campus and knowing that the campus is younger than the Vancouver campus. And I think about goal 5 and enriching our spaces, and knowing that our campus will grow in size over the next coming years. And what does that look like? And there's a tremendous opportunity to really honor the place where we're located and have that reflected in the campus plan in all aspects, from buildings, but also actually how we honor the land and where we're located. So it's really exciting to think about all the goals and actions, and difficult to choose which one to be the most excited about.
Thank you, Adrian. And over to Cheryl.
Thanks, Vicky. One of the challenges in going last is to come up with something that everyone else ahead of you didn't already say, because I agree with each and every person who has already spoken, and I'm excited about each and every one of those components about the ISP. And I think I speak from the position of one of the people who was at the beginning stage and helped design the engagement process and was there all the way through. And I think what struck me the most when this task landed on my desk was that even though we had been involved in this kind of work for literally decades already, and we were well into a mature Aboriginal strategic plan from 2008, 2009, what we heard and what we saw was that things still weren't right. The Indigenous student experience needed improvement. The Indigenous faculty experience needed improvement. The staff experience needed improvement. That there were still things wrong and we still had a lot of work to do. And even though we had been doing all of that work already, what I started to ponder was what yet needed to change. And it was clear that we needed to do a few things. We needed to really create the impetus and the momentum for some structural changes, because that was the sticky piece that wasn't moving yet. And so we needed to change up the model. And then the question was, well, how do we go about doing that? And I was completely opposed from my background and my community roots to anything top down, because I know that wasn't going to work. And so we flipped that model on its head, and I'm very proud of how all of these communities stepped up, students, faculty, staff. We were overwhelmed some days with the amount of people that were coming forward. We filled up our engagement sessions. We had to turn people away or send them off to new sessions. People were so excited about doing this and people wanted to give input. So we did not imagine 2,500 people stepping forward with all of these comments and ideas. And I was just thrilled when it happened, because that told us that there was energy and desire for change. And so it was time to really tap into that energy and momentum and move it forward. All of that, relationships, grounding in the declaration, I think that's all exciting. The one piece for me, in particular, as an Indigenous leader in the university, is that it addresses and attempts to deal with a problem that has been everywhere across Canada and New Zealand and Australia and the United States, which is that all too often, Indigenous leadership ends up with responsibility for implementing a plan over which they have no accountabilities, no budgets, no say. In other words, they take the accountability for the entire university on their heads. And that's why often these positions are so draining and exhausting on people, and they tend to last about 18 months, is because the model was wrong. So we went after the model, and what we did is said, no one office and no one person should be responsible for this. It's a collective responsibility. And then we set about creating these committee structures so that that responsibility was spread throughout the institution, both horizontally and vertically. And therefore, I sometimes called it little spidey fingers penetrating the university structure, so that wherever anyone turns around, we're all there, and pushing and prodding, and therefore keeping responsibility and accountability in the same offices and in the same space. So that's why we say when everyone's responsible for it, that's exactly what we're getting at, is that it's not okay to silo it off to a few Indigenous peoples who are going to be exhausted. We've tried to turn that model on its head. And so for me, that's a very particularly exciting development.
Thank you, Dr. Lightfoot. Excellent comments. I totally agree with them. So we are going to move over to our second question. From where you sit at UBC, what do you see as the primary challenges at UBC, and how do you see the ISP helping you in addressing those challenges? Maybe highlight 3 areas and think of the short, medium, and long-term lookout. And I will start with Carrie.
Hi again. So I think I actually answered that question the first round. I thought it was a 2-part question. And so, yeah, the challenges that I see are mainly like logistically and with the communication infrastructure process. But I think, you know, the plan definitely addresses that in terms of the way that, as we saw today with the toolkit and the self-assessment, that already gets people, you know, building awareness around what to focus on for them in their unit, in their area. And yeah, so the self-assessment, I think, is remedying that. And then also the intent to implementation tool also. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. Over to you, Noah.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so for a short-term challenge, I kind of think, again, kind of going off what Carrie said, like communication and like gathering. I've been a peer mentor for 3 years, so I've worked with a lot of first-year Indigenous students. And a challenge a lot of them seem to face is kind of finding community on campus, as there is the Indigenous program services here. A lot kind of seem to disconnect from certain things. So a short-term thing could maybe be seeing more Indigenous signage on campus, Indigenous food, just more ways to help build community. I would say more of a middle term would be maybe more student representation on campus, more so Indigenous focused. That could be also student ambassadors. So maybe they have like an Indigenous student ambassador representative, and also with the student union, they could have an Indigenous student union representative. There's so many different ways I think the university could help implement more Indigenous voice and Indigenous students across campus. And for long-term, a challenge I see for the campus, I'm unsure about how the Vancouver campus is with this, but more so for the Okanagan campus is with Indigenous faculty and course offering. They definitely can be not very much selection all the time, which maybe if they offered more courses to kind of help broaden your education, maybe more Indigenous courses outside of Indigenous studies as well. Like I'm in a class with Dr. Charnley in cultural studies in Indigenous literature. So it would be really amazing, you know, to help broaden other people's education outside of Indigenous studies, like including more in English or maybe even in science, art history. There's so many different ways that Indigenous representation and Indigenous knowledge can be incorporated into the university. And yeah.
Great, thanks, Noah. And so we don't leave Cheryl till last. I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl.
Thanks, Vicky. And a couple of things come to mind, and I'm going to build a little bit off what Noah just said, because to my mind, that's one of the short-term challenges. And just a little story, one of my departments, political science, did a survey of teaching faculty in the year before we even started planning the Indigenous Strategic Plan. So this was a TRC motivated survey. And they asked all the faculty in a completely anonymous survey whether they're putting Indigenous content into their syllabi. Yes, no, and then how much. And a full half said no. This is in political science, mind you, because I find this striking because everything about Indigenous peoples is political, but half of them said no. And then the reason they gave was not relevant to the course that I'm teaching. And I was just so struck and appalled by that. And of course, the anonymous survey encourages people to be terrifically honest. So I appreciated the honesty. But what that told me when we were designing ISP is we needed to get people talking and thinking and prompt and prod them to go deeper and think about relevance, and then start including content, go in search of content that makes sense to speak to that relevance. And I'm happy to say this does have a happy ending. So a couple years now, now that we're a full year into ISP, there is significantly more Indigenous content in those courses. And I think ISP has begun to address that. And I see that potential multiplying across every teaching unit in the university. For medium term, I think one of the challenges that I see, and particularly in Vancouver, since this is where I spend most of my time, is what the relationship is between UBC campus and Musqueam. I see Musqueam being tapped for an awful lot of resources and emotional and other labor. And I think the ISP provides some helpful advice and guidance on how to better respect and honor that time and that commitment and that labor. So I look forward to that. And then longer term, and I think I put this in the longer term because it is really a difficult question, is how Indigenous community-based research gets properly recognized, evaluated, supported, and celebrated within the tenure and promotion process of a Western university. It's a formidable challenge. Those conversations are happening. I'm very happy to report. So the ISP in part has brought, and at least the discussions around ISP have brought that particular question, to the front burner in many cases. And I'm hoping, and I hope long isn't too long, because these are really important questions of how that kind of research and Indigenous-based knowledge gets properly evaluated and recognized on an equal basis to other more mainstream kinds of research.
Thanks, Cheryl. And I'm going to pass it over to Adrian.
Thank you, Vicky. I think a barrier is I think with good intentions, units and portfolios may want to be quick to act and start implementing goals and actions with good intentions. But I think it's really critical at all short, medium, and long-term goals in implementing the ISP. That's really critical that units really engage in a process that reflects a respectful relationship. If it's a respectful relationship with Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, and communities, it's just really critical to trust that relationship building process, and the outcomes will come. But I think sometimes that can be challenging and difficult to know that building a relationship and a relational process takes time, and it always doesn't align with different, if it's academic year, fiscal year, research funding years, but knowing that it's okay, because I think if we focus on doing a really good job, focusing on building a relevant relationship, those outcomes will follow. And so I really think it's important that we pay attention to that in the short, medium, and long term.
Thank you, Adrian. Noah, your hand's up. Did I need to circle back to you?
Yeah, sorry, actually I had something to kind of mention alongside Cheryl's point that I found was really interesting. So she talked about the poli-sci teachers, about that anonymous survey. Now that really stood out to me because I'm in an Indigenous education course this semester, and we talk about teachers' accountability with Indigenous education and Indigenous knowledge overall. And it's very interesting because a lot of teachers or educators don't take it accountably, or they don't kind of take into their own hands to teach and kind of just follow the old school curriculum and fall into that habit. And we talked about how UBC kind of took it not away from them, but kind of took it out from that and put it as in the new BA got kind of whole revamped, and you're allowed to, or sorry, it's required to take Indigenous 100 here at UBC Okanagan. But we also mentioned how that can also be like a really fine line to kind of stand on, because racism does come out from that, from making an Indigenous course required. And like, there's a lot of controversial topics. Some people saying it shouldn't be required, they learn it in high school. So it's a really interesting point, just how accountability with teachers, but I just want to say that.
Thank you, Noah. I totally appreciate those added comments from you. And I will turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you. And actually, I want to build off of what Noah was talking about, because that was actually my first thought. Was one of the big challenges is, we still have a lot of classrooms where our students aren't safe, and where we still have teachers who are engaging in really violent teaching practices, even with the best of intentions, right? And so I think for me, and I don't know whether this is a short, medium, or long-term thing. I think a lot depends on what people are willing to do and when they're willing to do it. But I think a huge challenge that we still have is not just what Cheryl was talking about in terms of faculties understanding relevance, but making sure that the discussion of these issues is done with care. And I think there are still places in a lot of our classrooms where even really well-meaning teachers forget Indigenous humanity when talking about Indigenous issues and concerns. So I think that for me would be one thing. And I think the Indigenous Strategic Plan, the call for unit-specific accountability and focus is a really important way for units to start thinking about how their very classrooms are sites where that can be places of good learning or of harm. My second thought was, one of the concerns is, we're in the corporation of the University of British Columbia. It's a corporate structure, and I think there's always a danger of co-optation by existing power structures. I think the strategic plan pushes against that in terms of its ground up commitments. But we've seen this with reconciliation and the Canadian government. I mean, we talk about reconciliation, but it's actually truth and reconciliation. And I think there are ways in which I hope the strategic plan can always be a bit troubling to the institution, but all troubling in a really good way, that it's never so comfortable that there isn't work to be done. And I think the strategic plan gives us really good guidance for keeping us always working toward better relations, because relations are never fixed, they're ongoing. And if you want good relations, you have to keep going at it. And the plan gives guidance that way. And I guess my last thought was just, to echo some of the other thoughts, but the structural change. I mean, we're seeing changes in a lot of policies and practices, but there are power structures that also need to change, and accountability structures, especially in relationship to our host nations, but to other nations from whom the university extracts a lot of resources, human resources and emotional resources, and also environmental resources. So I think the plan, because of its focus on accountability, is a really helpful blueprint in that way. But that, I think that for me is the big long-term change. Like Vicky, we have that beautiful picture behind you of the university endowment lands, and the university has done quite well financially from lands that are Musqueam traditional territory, right? And that's just at Vancouver, not to count elsewhere. So I think those structural changes will be, I think that's a big one. But I think that the commitment to those principles of UNDRIP that are in the plan, and the vision of the plan as an ongoing affirmation of relationship, I think that gives us a good way forward. But it's going to require a lot of courage, and it's going to require a lot of openness. And those two things, I believe we have in abundance, but we need to see those things realized in structures, not just in words, not just at UBC, but across this country called Canada.
Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate those comments. And Cheryl, I see what you mean about going last. There's some great comments with answering the question, and I so appreciate that. And I'm just quickly thinking off the top of my head which one I can build upon, because I actually want to build upon all of them. But I think what I'll focus on is the primary challenge at UBC for what I see is Indigenous engagement. I see a lot of folks still not understanding about where and when to engage with Indigenous people at UBC. And oftentimes I point to the Indigenous Strategic Plan for them to read, and then also with the Toolkit and going through that process and recognizing that Indigenous people, this is a collective effort, and also the onus can't always be on Indigenous people to guide the implementation of the ISP. And when you are engaging with Indigenous people, whether it's on university or outside of the university, not to engage with us with something that is already put to pen to paper, and not inviting us in halfway through or at the end to get our input. That is not engagement, and that is not what the ISP has done. Our ISP process document is very clear about our engagement sessions and how we did that. And it is an excellent tool and guide for other folks to follow. So that is one thing that I see in the immediate. However, I can see that as these structural changes are happening, as the panelists have shared, that is also improving. I'm also seeing improvements with folks, engaging with Indigenous folks at the beginning, and not at the middle and not at the end, and getting our input, and also recognizing our timelines, as Adrian has pointed out, that our timelines at the university, we have a lot of competing deadlines, and also honoring and recognizing that, whether you're a student, staff, or a faculty member. And then the other challenges I would say is just currently there's two things I would say is, when I'm doing the ISP self-assessment toolkits and doing any toolkit sessions with folks, I think it's really important to also recognize that self-facilitation is also important, and we do have self-facilitation tips in our toolkit. And we did this thoughtfully when we organized and worked on the toolkit. Rest assured that the toolkit has Indigenous input, and it was Indigenous-led. So we basically thought of everything that we could, so that when folks came to the 2020 online virtual celebration of the launch, and shortly afterwards we went to work with the toolkit, because we had people coming to us and saying, okay, now what? And so we created the toolkit to answer a lot of those questions, and it gave you a place to start your journey with the implementation toolkit. And so that is really important when folks, maybe reach out to other Indigenous folks on campus. We can tell if you haven't read the toolkit. We can tell if you haven't read the ISP document. And, I'm just being mindful of, the Indigenous people's time when we've put a lot of work and effort into toolkits and documents. And you might come to think that Indigenous engagement means that, for a lack of phrasing this, that it's up to us to tell you what to do. At some point with truth and reconciliation, you do need to come to a point where you can move forward in a positive and safe manner, and work within your unit and faculty and in your classrooms. and you have the tools and resources there. I always suggest that we look at our ISP website where we do have the toolkit and we do have resources there for you. And as well, you can also reach out to the OIC office for any questions on guidance or feedback. So I think those are the things that I wanted to touch on. And I will go to our third question, which is, looking at the time, yes, okay. Our third question is, what have you been hearing on the ground about ISP advancement over the past year? And I'm going to go to Daniel since he hasn't gone first yet.
I was waiting to go later. So what have I heard on the ground? I've actually heard quite a bit in terms, especially around conversations with hiring, some of the hiring committees that I'm on, thinking about ways that the hiring is speaking with the ISP and realizing some of the goals. So that has been really exciting to me, that I wasn't the person who had to bring it up, that it actually was other people and non-Indigenous people who've brought that up in other departments and other units. So that, I think, is one tangible place where I'm seeing some real interest and commitment. Yeah, and also just thinking about kind of where we are and our obligations in territory. I'm hearing that from folks who are, teach in areas that might seem very distant from Indigenous context to people who don't know, but a lot of folks are quite excited about how they might better engage with indigeneity in their own work, even if it feels like it might be at a remove. And then, of course, they find that it's never at a remove because indigeneity is relevant to absolutely everything.
Thanks, Daniel. Adrienne.
Thank you, Vicky. I've been hearing a lot of excitement about the ISP toolkit from across campus, from colleagues in different portfolios and faculties. They've been really just so tremendously appreciative of the toolkit that accompanies the guide to really provide those tangible steps of how to go through the ISP at a unit or portfolio level and really think about how they can make progress towards implementing the ISP. I've also have heard that through that process, they have had just tremendous conversations and reflections and just reaching out to also just learn more in general. So it's been really exciting to hear that feedback from a variety of different individuals.
Adrienne, over to you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Vicky. Because I work so often, not just at UBC, but also internationally, even during the pandemic, Zoom has allowed us to keep doing a lot of work internationally, both for better and for worse, and that's a different conversation. But in the year since we launched the plan, and I was really pleased that on our virtual launch day back in September of 2020, we had viewers, and Zoom lets you see who all is logging in. We had viewers from 19 different countries that day. And so even as we were launching, we had a great deal of international attention and Indigenous community-based attention, and normally Indigenous communities don't pay too much mind to what universities are doing, unless that the university or a set of researchers are knocking on their door. They pretty much ignore what universities are doing. ISP has changed that, and it's got people talking out there, and so I'm really excited about that. And while there's a lot of interest and excitement, I think there's also a lot of let's wait and see how this plays out conversations going on. So there's a healthy skepticism out there at the community level, watching the rollout of this plan and what we're actually able to do year to year. So I think there's a lot of pressure on UBC to make good on these commitments because there are a lot of eyes watching across the country and also internationally. So just from where I sit, that's what I see.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. Over to you, Noah.
Thank you. So I am pretty new to the strategic plan. I've only been on for several months now, but it was a very new idea to me. I never knew that this was a real thing here, which I feel like kind of speaks to the student body as well. When I told most of my friends that I was part of this, none of them knew that this was even existed. So it made me realize that maybe people aren't reading their emails, or maybe just it isn't being promoted to the student body as much, because none of them knew that this was even happening. So it made them like tell me lots of things, like almost like the messenger, like, oh, like maybe bring this up. So I think maybe moving forward, I'd love to see maybe more student representatives on the strategic plan. I think that could be something interesting to think about down further the line.
Thanks, Noah. Carrie.
Hi again. So one of the things that we're doing at UBC Okanagan that's really cool that I think, you know, connects with the Indigenous Strategic Plan and probably is supported and inspired by the Indigenous Strategic Plan is the new BA with the Indig content. So all students need to take courses with Indig content. And so I'm on a committee that sort of helps with that in terms of, you know, faculty across the campus are really looking at, you know, where is the Indig content here, you know, in engineering and applied science and mathematics and health sciences, biology, even Japanese language courses, you know, where is the Indig content? And it can, you know, like Daniel said, you know, it can be everywhere, really. And so faculty are wondering, you know, how do I do this in a respectful way? And so there's a lot of buzz at UBC Okanagan around this. And but that's something that I've really seen that's really amazing and percolating right now.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Okay, my turn to answer the question. So I've been thinking about this and trying to build off the other panelists' comments. I think what I'll add is what I've been hearing on the ground, just because I do participate in ISP Toolkit sessions, is that it's an opportunity for folks to really slow down and to have these really important discussions. Never before has there been an opportunity for folks to go through the toolkit and answer those questions in a safe environment, albeit by Zoom in this pandemic world. But we share space and we share feedback and comments, and we actually learn from each other. And so there's this dialogue that hasn't really happened yet. And some folks are a little bit apprehensive at first because this is new and there hasn't been a space developed or a space made for folks to have these conversations. And really, you learn so much about the people that you work with. I have seen conversations where I've worked with a unit and they have shared important resources with each other, or they learned more about one another, which really is part of that relationship building, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. This is actually allowing UBC folks across the board to have these discussions and conversations with each other. Someone told me years ago that UBC sometimes isn't so great about talking with each other. Well, this is happening, and it's refreshing for me to experience and to see that. And so and I've also been hearing this on the ground as well with feedback from their folks that have gone through the toolkit, and they've shared their stories on our ISP website, which are really, really great stories about their journey as they've journeyed through the toolkit. So that's what I would say. Okay, so we are at 3:50, and I'm going to go to some of our questions from folks that are signed in and attending today. So there is one question for the panel, and here it is. 1 second. Yes. Question for you. Can you give an example of a unit that has started to do this well to make some progress, and how they interacted with support provided by UBC to do so? Anybody like to start us off? Okay, I will ask Daniel.
I'm in Indigenous studies, and this is part of the conversations we have. It's a tricky question, right? Because I think a lot of units are in the early stages or are undertaking this. So units like I'm affiliated with English. The Department of English is starting to ask these questions and starting to take these issues quite seriously. And there's been ongoing commitment in different ways, but it's starting to kind of be realized in questions that are happening in a lot of different courses throughout the curriculum in English. I know other departments like geography have been quite interested in these questions and these issues for a long time, but are taking them up much more substantially. And not just in terms of wanting to hire Indigenous scholars who are specialists in the area, but thinking about, okay, how is this a shared commitment and a shared value? But we're still, I think in a lot of ways, we're still in early days for a lot of units. So I would say that most of the units that I'm aware of are, from what I hear from students and staff and faculty, and a lot of these, at least in the Faculty of Arts, these are really active conversations. So I think that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of positivity. But I think there are still a lot of questions, and there's still, I think that self-assessment process is going to be really important. I think every unit has important work to do, even critical Indigenous studies. I mean, we still have to ask these questions of ourselves, and this is what we do, right? There's nobody who is not, who shouldn't be thinking very deeply about what this means to the work that we're doing.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Cheryl?
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Daniel. I'm going to build on that a little bit and agree with you. It is a tricky question because what we noticed immediately when we first set out to work on the plan was the tremendous spectrum at both campuses in terms of what Indigenous engagement already existed. So we talked to I talked to every dean across both campuses in the very early stage. And what I found was some faculties have been doing this deep work for literally decades and are already quite well along. Others have not yet given it a thought up until there was an expectation that they do so with ISP. And then a whole lot of people and units in between. So I think the important thing here that we try to emphasize to everyone is no matter where you're starting from, you have work to do. And it's important that that work be done in conversation, in dialogue, thoughtfully, not quickly, which is a big challenge at universities and quite honestly, most institutional structures, because everyone is motivated to submit an annual report at the end of the year with a bullet list of their accomplishments. We're trying to push back against that and say, we want everyone to really deeply reflect on where you currently are and then design a plan to make improvements from where you are. So it's very individualized, and that's not to let anyone off the hook, because we do expect everyone to do deep work and to make meaningful change. It's just that that change is going to look incredibly different to everyone across both campuses, because contexts and histories and lived experiences are also different.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'll just read the question over just again before I go on to the next panelist. So the question is, can you give an example of a unit that has started to do this well to make some progress, and how they interacted with the support provided by UBC to do so? And I will hand it over to Carrie.
Thank you. So, you know, I'm thinking about my own department of English and Cultural Studies, and the faculty that I'm in, Creative and Critical Studies. You know, they hired me in the past just over a year, and you know, I think that was part of the work that they'd done, their self-assessment and reflection, and their you know, deep dedication to you know, implementing the Indigenous Strategic Plan and just being honored, you know, respectful and honorable to the relationship with the Silk Nation and people and you know, UNDRIP and all of that. So we have hired, you know, I think, you know, this question kind of speaks to people are looking for models, right? Where has this been done well? You know, what does this look like? You know, and as Cheryl's been saying, it looks different for everyone, right? It can look different for everyone. So it's about doing that self-assessment, looking at the tool, and finding what works for you. What is it going to look like for you? And that is challenging, and that takes courage. But it is also important to see what role models exist, because that helps, you know, conceptualize what it could look like and how your area might be different. So for us, we have hired 2 elders from the Silk Nation who have been doing for over a decade now cultural safety work. So they have a cultural safety program, and all staff and faculty are invited and welcome to take this program. And they're also available for consultations and class visits and things like that. And that is just our faculty. That's what what is working for us and is part of this process. And we have an Indigenous Advisory Committee as well. So, and other things going on in that regard.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So I'm looking at our time and we have a few minutes left. So I think I will wrap up the panelist questions. And I just want to thank from the bottom of my heart to Daniel and Adrian and Cheryl and Noah and Carrie for your comments and feedback and input today on a very important discussion. And it's been an honor and privilege to be your moderator today as well, and also a panelist. So I will turn this back over to Drew for some closing remarks. Oh, and also thank you to the Learning Circle for always putting on such great events. And it's always an honor working with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky, Dr. Lightfoot, Adrian, Dr. Justice, Dr. Charnley, and Noah for an amazing discussion. I think that that we're working towards something, and I think I can take away from the conversation today that it's going to be a process, and there is no direct result result expected in 1 year. It's about the process and how we can move forward in a very good way. And I think that what we were talking about today here is the path that we do need to follow. So thank you for your thoughts there. We would like to close by thanking the First Nations Health Authority, the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, and the UBC Okanagan campus for making this webinar possible. Just before we end the webinar today, we would love to bring your attention to 2 upcoming UBC Learning Circle webinars, which we will be moving forward with. The first one is Sober for October, and part 2 of the Challenging Ideology series, looking at historical museum practices through an Indigenous lens. All of these webinars are free to sign up for on our website, www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next Learning Circle. Marcy.